The morning sun rose slowly over the dunes, painting the sky with soft orange and gold colors. The desert, quiet and endless, stretched out in every direction. The explorer woke up to the sound of the wind brushing over the sand. His body ached a little from the long walk and the cold night. But as soon as he turned his head and saw the huge ship sitting there in the sand, he felt a rush of excitement again. For a few moments, he just sat there, staring at the enormous shape of the cruise ship. In the early sunlight, it looked even stranger than it had the day before. It stood like a silent giant, its shadow falling across the dunes as if it didn't belong to this world. The name Aurora Queen was clearer now in the bright light. The letters were old and rusty, but they were still there, a reminder that this wasn't a dream. It was real. He got up, brushed the sand off his clothes, and walked slowly toward the ship again. This time he didn't rush. He wanted to take in every detail. The closer he got, the more he noticed. Parts of the hull were bent and cracked, as if something massive had hit it long ago. Rust streaked down the sides like brown tears. Some of the windows were shattered and others were so dusty that they almost looked painted over. He stopped at the base of the ship and ran his hand over the metal surface. It was rough, warm from the early sun. It was hard to believe this thing had once floated on water. There was no river nearby, no ocean, no lake, just endless dry land. How could something this big travel here? The question stuck in his head like a song he couldn't forget. He climbed the same rusty ladder he had used the day before. It creaked beneath his weight, and a part of him wondered how it was still holding on after all these years. When he reached the deck, a soft wind moved across it, lifting small grains of sand into the air. The place was quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like the ship was holding its breath, waiting for someone to wake it up. He walked past the empty pool in the middle of the deck. The tiles were cracked and the metal railings were rusted. A few broken deck chairs lay on their sides, half buried in sand. He imagined families laughing here, children splashing in the water, music playing, but now it was just silence and dust. He made his way toward the large glass doors again, this time with a plan. The day before, he had only taken a short look inside. Today, he wanted to explore more. He pushed the door open wider, stepped into the hallway, and switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, landing on old posters still hanging on the wall. The edges were torn and the colors had faded almost completely. As he walked deeper inside, the air grew cooler. The ship felt strange, almost like it was asleep. His boots echoed softly against the floor. He passed a sign with gold letters that said Grand Dining Hall. He decided to follow it. The hallway opened into a large room with tall ceilings and huge windows that were now covered with sand and dirt. The tables were still there. Some of them were standing. Some had collapsed. A few plates and glasses were scattered across them as if people had left in a hurry. Dust covered everything like a thin blanket. He walked between the tables slowly, trying to imagine what it looked like when it was alive with people. He could almost hear the clinking of glasses and soft chatter. Near one of the tables, he noticed something odd. A silver spoon lay on the floor, shining faintly under the flashlight. He picked it up and turned it in his hand. It was still smooth, though a bit tarnished from time. It was such a small thing, but it reminded him that real people had been here. This wasn't just an empty shell. It was once full of life. He left the dining hall and followed another hallway that led to the cabins. The walls were peeling and the carpet was worn out, but the doors were still in place. He tried a few of the handles. Most were locked, but one door opened with a soft creak. Inside, the room was small and neat, like any cabin you'd find on an old cruise ship. There was a bed, a small desk, and a mirror hanging crooked on the wall. The strangest part was that everything looked like someone had just stepped out and never returned. A pair of shoes lay by the bed. An old newspaper was folded neatly on the desk. The pages were yellow and fragile. He picked it up carefully and saw the date printed on the top, 1953. His heart beat faster. That meant this ship had been here for more than 60 years. He set the paper back down and moved toward the mirror. The glass was dusty, but he wiped it with his hand. For a second, his own reflection startled him. It was strange seeing a living face in a place that had been abandoned for so long. As he turned to leave the cabin, something caught his eye. A small leather-bound book was sticking out from under the bed. He knelt down and pulled it out. It was a journal. The cover was worn and the pages were yellow, but it was still readable. He flipped through it carefully. The handwriting was neat and delicate. written in ink. The first few pages talked about the start of a journey. Whoever wrote it had been a passenger on this ship. They described the deck, the ocean, the food, the music. Everything sounded cheerful, like the beginning of a holiday. But as he kept reading, the tone slowly changed. The last few entries were shorter, shakier. Words like storm and strange lights appeared again and again. The final line was only 3 words. Something is wrong. He closed the book slowly, his hands trembling just a little. Whatever had happened here wasn't just a mechanical failure. Something unexpected had taken place, and no one had ever told the story. He tucked the journal carefully into his bag and continued exploring. The ship was bigger than he had imagined. Every hallway seemed to lead to another, and some parts were blocked by fallen beams and piles of sand. But the deeper he went, the more he felt that this place had a story waiting to be uncovered. He eventually found himself standing in front of a heavy steel door. It had once been painted white, but the color had peeled off, leaving only rust and scratches. Above the door, a sign read, "Engine Room." He tried the handle, but it didn't move. Sand had piled up around the bottom, sealing it shut. He grabbed a metal rod from the floor and started digging away the sand carefully. It took time, but after a while, the door finally budged. It opened with a loud groan echoing down the hallway. Inside, the air smelled different. It was cooler, heavier. His flashlight beam landed on rows of old machinery, pipes and rusted levers. This was the heart of the ship. He walked carefully between the equipment, brushing away the sand. A few old dials were still frozen in place, their needles pointing nowhere. Then something caught his eye. On one of the control panels, a small green light was still faintly glowing. It was weak, but it was there. His first thought was that it was impossible. There was no power out here, but the light flickered softly, like the last breath of a dying battery. It meant something inside this ship had lasted for decades. He leaned closer, inspecting the control panel. There were markings and switches he didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. The engines had been running far longer than they should have after the ship had disappeared. The gauges showed signs of a sudden stop, as if the ship had been moving normally one moment and then everything had ended at once. He stepped back, his mind racing. How could a ship like this end up hundreds of miles from the sea, still showing signs of power after so many years? None of it made sense. He heard the wind outside picking up, whistling through the cracks in the hull. The sound echoed through the engine room, low and strange, like a distant sigh. For a moment he imagined what it must have been like on the day everything changed. The engines roaring, the captain shouting orders, passengers confused and frightened, a storm outside. And then silence, just silence. He climbed back up to the deck just as the sun began to sink again. He sat down near the railing, looking out at the dunes. The desert was calm, but his mind wasn't. He had come here hoping to find out what the reflection in the sand was. But now he had found something much bigger than a wreck. He held the journal in his hands and opened it again. He read the last line once more. Something is wrong. He didn't know what had happened yet, but he could feel it deep down. This wasn't just a lost ship. This was the beginning of a mystery that someone had tried to bury. And now, after all these years, the sand was giving up its secret. The explorer zipped the journal back into his bag and leaned against the railing, the sky turning a deep red over the horizon. Tomorrow he would go deeper. He would find the answers hidden in the heart of this forgotten vessel. But for now the ship sat silently in the desert, as if watching him back. And he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The sun climbed slowly into the pale sky, casting a golden glow over the endless dunes. The explorer opened his eyes to the soft sound of wind brushing against the metal hull of the ship. His back ached a little from sleeping on the hard ground, but his mind was wide awake. He turned and stared at the giant structure towering above him. Even though this was his 3rd day in the desert, the sight of the massive cruise ship still didn't feel real. It looked out of place, like a piece of a forgotten world that had somehow landed here by mistake. He took a deep breath, dusted the sand off his clothes, and stood up. This was the day he planned to go deeper into the ship. He had explored the upper deck and some of the passenger areas. He had walked through empty dining rooms, dusty cabins, and the old engine room. But a part of the ship remained unexplored, the lower decks. Something about them made him uneasy. Maybe it was how silent it felt down there, or maybe it was just the way the wind sometimes whistled through the cracks in the hull, sounding almost like a voice. He packed his small bag carefully, making sure to bring extra water, a flashlight, and the journal he had found in the cabin the day before. He wasn't sure why, but having that little book made him feel less alone. It was proof that someone had been here long ago, living a story he was now walking through. The climb back up the rusty ladder was slow. The metal creaked under his weight and small bits of rust fell away with every step. When he reached the deck, the morning light washed over the abandoned pool and broken chairs. He paused for a moment, listening. There was no one there but the wind. Still, the ship felt alive in a strange, quiet way. He made his way to the glass doors and stepped inside. The air inside the ship was cool and heavy. Dust floated in the air like thin smoke, shining softly in the light coming through the cracks. He passed the dining hall, the hallways, and the cabins he had already explored. As he moved deeper, the corridors grew darker. The lower decks weren't touched by sunlight at all. He switched on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on peeling paint, broken signs, and sand that had blown in through the cracks. The stairs to the lower deck were narrow and steep. They creaked under his boots as he went down slowly, careful not to slip. The air changed as he descended. It felt colder, heavier, and quieter, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. At the bottom of the stairs, a long hallway stretched out in front of him. The ceiling was low and the walls were streaked with rust. A soft drip echoed somewhere in the darkness, though he had no idea where it came from. He walked slowly, shining his light left and right. The first few rooms were empty storage areas. Old crates sat in the corners, their wood cracked and soft with age. Some of them were open, revealing old linens and broken dishes. It looked like the crew had left everything behind in a hurry. Further down the hallway, he found a door slightly open. He pushed it gently and stepped inside. It was a small control room. Old machines lined the walls, radios, switches, and wires covered in dust. A chair sat in the corner, tipped over on its side. He moved closer to one of the panels and brushed away the sand. The dials were frozen, but the labels were still clear. Communication room. He imagined what it must have been like on that last day. People rushing, alarms ringing, voices over the radio calling for help. And then silence. On the floor near the chair, he found something half buried in the sand, a small photograph. He picked it up carefully. It was black and white, worn around the edges. It showed a group of passengers on the deck of the ship smiling. Their clothes were neat and elegant, like something out of an old movie. On the back of the photo, someone had written a date, 1953. He slipped the photo into his pocket. The more he explored, the more real these people felt. They weren't just shadows from the past. They had been here, laughing and living their lives, never knowing their journey would end in the middle of a desert. He left the communication room and walked farther down the hallway. The deeper he went, the stranger it felt. The air grew colder. A soft humming sound seemed to come from somewhere below him. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration in the metal. At the end of the hallway, he found a heavy steel door. It was sealed with a large wheel lock, the kind used to keep water out. It looked solid, but years of sand had piled up against it. He knelt down and started brushing away the sand with his hands. It took time, but little by little, the base cleared. He placed both hands on the wheel and tried turning it. At first, it didn't move, but with a few more tries and all his strength, it slowly gave way with a long, low groan. The door opened, revealing a narrow staircase that led down even deeper. The air that rushed out was cold and dry. His flashlight beam flickered slightly, which made him grip it tighter. He stood at the top of the stairs, breathing slowly. This was the part of the ship no one had seen in decades. Step by step, he descended into the darkness. The walls were wet in places, and the air smelled old, like metal and earth. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a wide room. The floor was coated in a thin layer of sand. Old lights hung from the ceiling, long dead. This part of the ship was different. It didn't look like a passenger area. It was built for something else. The walls were lined with large steel crates. Some were closed and some had burst open over time. Inside them were strange equipment pieces he didn't recognize. Not passenger luggage, not simple storage. He walked slowly, shining his light on everything. The humming sound was louder now, coming from somewhere deeper in the room. He followed it until he found another panel on the wall. Unlike everything else on the ship, this panel wasn't covered in rust. It was clean, almost untouched. And there, just like in the engine room, a faint green light was glowing. He stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. He didn't touch anything, he just stared at it. How was it possible for a light to still be glowing after so many years in the middle of a desert? He noticed a small hatch below the panel, partially hidden by sand. He crouched down, cleared the sand away, and opened it carefully. Inside was a small metal box with thick cables leading out of it. The box hummed softly, as if something inside was still alive. He didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear. This ship hadn't been just a cruise liner. There was more to its story. He walked back toward the steel crates and shined the light on the stenciled letters printed on their sides. Most were faded, but he could still read a few words. Some said restricted. Others had a government seal printed on them. He frowned. What would something like that be doing on a luxury ship full of passengers? The air grew colder and the ship let out a low, soft groan, metal shifting somewhere far away. It made the floor vibrate slightly under his boots. For the first time, he felt a small shiver run down his spine. It wasn't fear exactly, but a feeling that he was standing in a place that wasn't meant to be found. He decided to head back up before it got too dark outside. The way back felt longer. The corridors seemed narrower and the silence heavier. When he finally reached the deck again, the sun was low in the sky, painting the desert in warm colors. He sat on the edge of the deck, looking out over the sand, breathing slowly. The journal lay on his lap. He opened it again, flipping to the last pages. The words were shaky, rushed. The writer had mentioned strange noises coming from below the ship, days before the storm had hit. They had talked about machines running at night and a place below the passenger deck that no one was allowed to see. His eyes lingered on one line near the end. The captain says it's just cargo. But I don't believe him. Something is happening down there. He closed the book slowly. It all started to fit together. The restricted crates, the hidden room, the glowing lights. Whatever had happened to this ship wasn't just a storm. Something else had been going on beneath the surface. The wind picked up, blowing sand across the deck. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the ship. He leaned back and stared at the fading sky. He had come here out of curiosity. But now it wasn't just about exploring an old wreck. It was about uncovering a story that had been buried under sand for more than 60 years. And he knew deep down that the answers weren't going to be simple. Tomorrow he would search again. He would open those crates, examine the hidden machinery, and find out what the crew had been hiding all those years ago. But for now he sat in silence, listening to the wind and the faint hum rising from the heart of the ship. The Aurora Queen was no ordinary cruise liner, and whatever secret it carried, the desert had been guarding it for a very long time. The sun rose early the next morning, and its golden light spilled across the endless dunes. The cruise ship still stood in silence, half buried in sand, as if waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. The group of experts walked toward it with heavy steps, each of them feeling the same mix of excitement and unease. No one could shake the feeling that this was not just an old wreck. Something about the ship's presence in the desert didn't feel ordinary. It felt wrong. The explorer who had discovered it led the way. His boots sank a little into the soft sand as he moved closer to the ship's side. The metal surface glistened under the sun, though rust and sand covered most of it. Behind him, one of the engineers carried a set of tools. Another man, a historian, held a folder with every record they had collected overnight. None of it made sense. The ship's name appeared in old maritime records, but there were no reports of it being lost in any storm, accident, or even sold for scrap. It was as if it had just disappeared one day and never returned. They climbed back up through the narrow opening they had made the previous day. The smell of old metal and dried salt filled the air inside. It was colder than outside, almost unnaturally cold, and the sound of the wind outside disappeared as soon as they stepped in. The silence was so heavy that every footstep echoed like a drumbeat. They moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything. The historian stopped in front of a large metal door near the middle of the corridor. On it, the faded letters of the ship's name were still visible. His eyes narrowed as he brushed off the sand and rust with his hand. This ship was supposed to be a luxury liner, he whispered softly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something. But this level of preservation, it's like time stopped here. The explorer didn't reply. His eyes were fixed ahead toward the stairs that led deeper down. They had explored the upper levels yesterday. What they found there still haunted everyone. the dining room with tables still set, the cabins with personal belongings scattered around. Everything was left behind as if people had simply vanished mid-journey. Today, they wanted to explore the lower sections of the ship, the engine room, the captain's office, and anything else that could offer clues. They descended the stairs slowly. The metal creaked under their weight. The deeper they went, the darker it got. Their flashlights moved across the walls, showing peeling paint, rusted pipes, and old signs with arrows pointing to different rooms. When they reached the engine room, everyone stopped. It was massive. Huge engines, long abandoned, stood silent like sleeping beasts. Dust coated everything. Yet there were still signs that someone had been here after the ship should have vanished. There were footprints in the thin layer of sand, leading toward the far wall. No one wanted to be the first to follow them, but the explorer finally stepped forward. The footprints ended near a heavy control panel. He leaned closer and wiped off the dust. The controls looked like they had been used recently, not recently in years, but far more preserved than the rest of the ship. One of the switches was stuck in the on position. It shouldn't have been. Power shouldn't exist here, and yet one of the small red indicator lights on the panel flickered faintly before going out again. The group exchanged looks. The engineer knelt down to check the wiring. "This is strange," he murmured. "There's no power source here. How could that light have turned on?" The explorer stayed quiet, but something cold crawled up his spine. This wasn't just a wreck. This ship had a story that no one understood yet. They decided to split into two groups. One team stayed behind to study the engines and wiring. The other team, including the explorer, headed to the captain's quarters. They walked through narrow hallways past doors that had long lost their paint. Some of the doors were slightly open, and inside they caught glimpses of rooms left in a hurry. Jackets on hooks, a cup on a table, a book still open to a page. It looked like people had planned to return but never did. The captain's room was larger than the others. A wooden desk sat at the center, covered in a thin layer of sand. A large map was spread across it. When the explorer lifted the map gently, something unexpected appeared beneath it. A black and white photograph. It showed the ship at sea, surrounded by a violent whirlpool-like formation in the water. The waves seemed to bend around a dark circular hole. At the bottom of the photo, there was a handwritten note with a date, 1953. The historian leaned closer, his voice a whisper. This is not a storm. Look at the shape. This looks like something pulling the ship." The explorer felt a chill run through him. He had seen whirlpools before, but nothing like this. This one looked too perfect, too circular. It didn't look natural. He flipped the photo and found coordinates written on the back. His heart skipped a beat when he checked the small handheld GPS device he always carried. The coordinates matched their exact location in the desert. The photo had been taken in the ocean, but the numbers pointed to the middle of nowhere on land. He placed the photograph back on the desk and opened the drawers. Inside, there were more notes written in a hurried hand. The captain had written about strange readings from the compass, about stars that didn't match their charts, and about an approaching storm that seemed to move against the wind. One line stood out among all the messy writing. "We are being pulled. The ocean is not behaving like the ocean anymore." As the group went through the notes, a strange sound echoed from somewhere deeper inside the ship. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone freeze. It sounded like metal bending slowly, as if the ship was alive and shifting its weight. The explorer turned off his flashlight for a second just to listen. There was silence, followed by another faint creak. He forced himself to breathe slowly. This was just an old ship. Old ships made noises. But something about this sound felt aware. They decided to return to the engine room with what they found. The engineer had something to show them, too. When they got back, he pointed at the control panel. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "There's still pressure in one of the pipes. Not full pressure, but something is feeding into the system. It's impossible, but it's real." One of the historians frowned. "But this ship's been gone for decades. How can anything still be working?" No one had an answer. They followed the pipes along the wall. Some led to tanks, others disappeared behind metal panels. The explorer crouched down and noticed something else. A set of new-looking bolts on one of the floor panels. Unlike everything else around, these bolts weren't rusted. Someone had opened this area not too long ago, or maybe someone never left. They carefully removed the bolts and lifted the panel. A narrow ladder led down into a space none of them had seen on the ship's original plans. A wave of cold air rushed out from below, far colder than the air in the rest of the ship. It smelled of damp metal and something else, something they couldn't quite name. The group stared at the dark hole for a long moment. Nobody spoke. Every instinct in their bodies told them not to go down, but curiosity was stronger. They had come this far, and turning back now felt impossible. The explorer went first, gripping the ladder tightly. The metal was cold, almost freezing to the touch. He climbed down slowly, flashlight pointing below. When he reached the bottom, he saw a long, narrow hallway that seemed to lead deeper into the ship. But this hallway didn't look like the rest of the vessel. It was newer, cleaner, and the walls were made of a different material. The others followed him down. Their footsteps echoed loudly. Somewhere far ahead, they heard a faint mechanical hum. It was soft but steady, like a heartbeat buried under layers of metal. As they walked forward, they passed sealed doors with warning labels in faded letters. Some were in languages they didn't understand. The engineer touched one of the doors and pulled his hand back quickly. It was warm. Something behind it was still running. This wasn't just an old cruise ship. Someone had built something else inside it, or had used it for something else entirely. The explorer's chest tightened as he realized the truth might be far bigger than just a ship lost at sea. They reached the end of the hallway where another large door stood. A single red light above it blinked weakly. The historian reached out and wiped the dust away from a small sign on the door. The letters read, "Restricted Section." No one said anything. The explorer's hand hovered over the handle. It felt heavier than it should, as if the door itself was warning him not to open it. But they had to know. They came here for answers. With a slow, steady pull, the door creaked open. Cold air rushed out and the hum grew louder. Behind the door, darkness waited, thick, silent, and heavy. What lay inside was still hidden, but everyone standing there understood one thing. This ship wasn't just lost. It had been taken. And whatever had taken it had left something behind. The heavy metal door finally gave way with a long groan that echoed through the hallway. Cold air rushed past them like a sudden winter breeze, carrying with it a faint metallic smell. For a moment, no one moved. The explorer stood at the front, hand still gripping the door handle. Behind him, the others waited in silence, holding their flashlights tightly as if letting go would leave them trapped in that darkness. The beam of light cut through the cold air and revealed what was inside. It wasn't a room like the others they had explored. This space was larger, wider, and felt strangely new compared to the old rusted parts of the ship. The floor was smooth and clean, as if someone had been maintaining it. Thick pipes ran along the walls, and the faint humming sound they had heard earlier was much clearer now. It came from the center of the room where a large sealed chamber stood. The chamber looked nothing like the rest of the cruise ship. It was shaped like a cylinder, built with shiny metal panels that hadn't aged the way everything else had. The explorer walked slowly toward it, each step echoing like a drum. His breath was visible in the cold air. The others followed, staying close together. When they reached the chamber, they saw a set of small screens built into the side of the metal surface. Some of them were cracked, but others were still faintly glowing. No power should have been running in this place, yet something deep inside the ship was still alive. One of the engineers stepped forward and brushed his hand over the surface. "This isn't from the 1950s, he whispered. "This looks far more advanced than anything built back then." The explorer didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a small control panel on the side. There was a red lever and a keypad, both covered in dust. The historian carefully stepped closer and wiped away some of the dust, revealing numbers faintly etched into the surface. They stared at the keypad in silence. No one said it out loud, but they all knew what was on their minds. Whatever was inside that chamber had been hidden for a reason, and opening it might give them answers or something they weren't ready to face. The explorer slowly placed his hand on the lever. For a second, his mind screamed at him to stop, to walk away, but curiosity was stronger. He pulled the lever down. A deep mechanical sound rumbled through the floor. Lights flickered to life around the chamber, glowing a pale blue. Everyone took a step back. The walls of the chamber began to separate with a hiss, releasing a wave of freezing air. As the gap widened, a soft, rhythmic sound became clear. It was the sound of machinery that had been running for a long, long time. Inside the chamber was a long metal table, and on it were rows of sealed crates. The crates were stacked neatly, each with markings that none of them recognized. Some were labeled with long strings of numbers and symbols. Others had warning signs that made no sense for a passenger ship. The historian knelt down to look at one of the crates closely. "This is not government grade," he whispered. "This isn't a vacation cruise." This ship was carrying something else. The explorer opened one of the crates carefully. Inside were metallic cylinders, tightly packed in foam and wrapped in layers of cloth. They didn't look like weapons, but they didn't look harmless either. None of it made sense. Why would a luxury ship be carrying crates like this? And why would it end up in the middle of the desert? As they examined the crates, one of the screens on the wall flickered brighter. Letters appeared on the screen in a language they didn't fully understand. The engineer stepped closer, squinting. "It's a system message," he said softly. "Something is still running." The humming sound grew louder. The pipes on the walls vibrated softly, as if something deep beneath the floor had awakened. A small red light began to blink on one of the panels. The explorer turned his flashlight toward the far corner of the room. That was when he noticed something that made him stop breathing for a second. On the wall, behind layers of grime and dust, there was a painted logo. It was faint but still visible. It wasn't the cruise line's emblem. It was a government insignia, one that dated back decades. The historian slowly walked closer and traced the faded logo with his fingers. "This ship wasn't just lost," he whispered. "It was erased. This was never supposed to be found." The engineer's voice broke through the silence. "We need to get out of here," he said firmly. "Whatever this is, it's not safe. If these systems are still active, we don't know what they could do." But before they could turn back, a deep rumbling shook the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the blinking red light turned solid. A low alarm echoed through the chamber, muffled but clear. Something had been triggered when the lever was pulled. The explorer's pulse raced. He looked around quickly, searching for a way out. The door they had entered through was still open, but the metal frame began to shift slightly, as if preparing to close on its own. They ran back toward the hallway, the sound of their footsteps mixing with the echo of the alarm. Just as they reached the ladder, the door began to slide shut with a slow, heavy sound. The explorer turned back one last time and saw the lights inside the chamber brighten even more. The crates were no longer silent. A soft clicking noise came from them, like something inside was unlocking. They climbed the ladder quickly and pulled themselves out into the engine room. The air up here felt warmer but thicker. The red light that had flickered earlier on the control panel was now steady, glowing like a warning they couldn't ignore. The group didn't stop to investigate further. They moved through the corridors, their flashlights bouncing off the walls. The ship, which had been silent before, now felt alive. They could hear distant groans, the sound of air moving through vents that hadn't worked in years. When they finally stepped out of the opening they had used to enter the ship, the desert sun felt like a relief. But even outside, the low hum from inside the vessel was still audible. It wasn't just old machinery. It was something still operating, something hidden beneath the layers of sand and time. They walked several meters away from the ship, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. None of them spoke for a long time. The historian clutched the old photograph they had found earlier. The engineer stared back at the rusted hull, his jaw tight. Finally, the explorer sat down on the sand and looked at the ship carefully. It wasn't just a piece of metal stuck in the desert. It was a secret buried in plain sight. Someone had built something inside it that didn't belong to any ordinary passenger vessel, and whatever it was still active. Later that day, after hours of silence, a group of official-looking vehicles appeared on the horizon. No one had called them, but they seemed to know exactly where to go. Men in uniform stepped out, their faces unreadable. They approached the group calmly but firmly, asking no questions. One of them simply said, "This site is now restricted." The group of explorers was escorted away without explanation. They weren't allowed to take anything with them, not even the notes, not even the photograph. They were told to forget what they had seen. The ship was quickly surrounded by temporary fences and covered by large sheets, hiding it from view. But even as they were driven away, the explorer couldn't stop looking back at it. The desert wind blew around it like a curtain. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a door had been opened, a door that no one was supposed to find. In the months that followed, rumors began to spread among the locals. Some said the ship had been dismantled and taken away piece by piece during the night. Others said it was still there, sealed off, with guards who never spoke to anyone. A few even claimed that on some nights faint music echoed from the direction of the wreck. Not loud, just soft, like a ghostly orchestra trapped inside. The explorer tried to move on, but the memory stayed. The photograph of the whirlpool, the captain's journal, the crates inside that cold chamber, all of it replayed in his mind over and over. He knew there was something more, something that had been carefully hidden from the world for decades. Sometimes, late at night, he would look at satellite images, searching for signs of the ship. But there was nothing, as if it had never been there at all, yet deep down he knew what he saw was real. The sand might cover the truth for now, but the ship had its own way of whispering to those who found it. Some mysteries don't stay buried forever. And somewhere in the desert, far from roads and cities, something beneath the dunes continued to hum softly, waiting for the next person curious enough to listen.